Well, good evening to everyone. For those I've not had a chance to meet, my name is John Highbush, and I have the honor of being the Executive Director of the Reagan Presidential Foundation. Thanks for coming out this evening. In honor of our men and women in uniform who defend our freedoms around the world, if you'd please stand and join me for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. Before we get started, there are a few people in the audience that I'd like to make sure we recognize this evening. And first, I'd like to welcome George Will's sister, Catherine Jorgensen. Catherine. From the Reagan Foundation Board of Trustees, Mr. Jerry Parencio. Jerry, I cannot overstate Jerry's extraordinary support for the Reagan Foundation over the years. This room and much of what you see at the Reagan Library is due to Jerry's incredible generosity. So thanks so much, Jerry. Our great former Congressman Elton Gallegly and his wife Janice. Elton. Finally, actor Robert Wool, who among many other films and television shows appeared in Batman with Michael Keaton. If you please, Robert, if you please stand. You know, he was in many shows, Arliss, Bull Durham as a movie, many things. But as some of you might know, we have a car show on an exhibit here right now in which we have the Batmobile from the movie that he was in. And Robert, if you'd like to take a spin, the keys are still in the car. Okay. It might be of interest to all of you that our guest speaker tonight made one stop along the way from Washington, D.C. to Simi Valley. He comes to us direct from a home on St. Cloud Avenue in Los Angeles, where a very special woman resides. You may have heard of her. Her name is Nancy Reagan, and she sends her warm greetings to all of you this evening. Now, the former First Lady has entertained world leaders and presidents at her residence for many years. But the odds that a newspaper columnist would get past the security of the Secret Service and through the front door of the home once occupied by our 40th president are about 1,000,000 to 1. That is, unless that newspaper columnist, author, and television personality is George Will. It is no secret, to be sure, that Mrs. Reagan and George have had a very special relationship since President Reagan occupied the White House. George, a friend of the Reagans for many years, has also been at the top of their list of favorite writers as well. Obviously, George has been a favorite for many here tonight, and I dare say for millions of people around the world who have followed him for decades. A Pulitzer Prize winner for commentary, his wisdom and wit have extended beyond the 450 newspapers and biweekly column he wrote for Newsweek for 35 years. Today, he is an influential voice on Fox News, where he joins the likes of Bret Baier, among others, during prime time and week time programming. Then there are the books. There literally are enough that I have lost track of one or two, I'm sure, but I believe there are as many as 8 books representing compilations of his columns, 3 books on political theory, and now 3 books on one of his favorite subjects, that being baseball. For those of you who didn't get a chance to get a signed book from George before tonight's program, there are several left that you can buy in the lobby, outside, or in the pavilion where you'll be having dinner tonight. Finally, in the interest of full disclosure, before asking George to take the stage tonight, I'd like to note that he is married to a charming and talented woman named Mari Will, someone who has actually kindly mentored me for most of my career and to whom I am truly indebted. She served as President Reagan's Director of Communications in the White House in his last years in office and is thought of fondly by Mrs. Reagan, myself, and all those who work here and elsewhere to keep the Reagan legacy alive. Again, speaking of those known fondly to Mrs. Reagan, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming to the stage Mr. George Will.
I want someone to get out of my briefcase a huge Senate immigration bill. Thank you very much. It's true that I only write about politics to support my baseball habit. I don't have a major league team. I'm a Cub fan, but it's been important in my life because I grew up midway between Chicago and St. Louis, and at an age too tender to make life-shaping decisions, I had to choose between being a Cub fan and a Cardinal fan. All my friends became Cardinal fans and grew up cheerful and liberal. I became a gloomy conservative. I want to talk to you tonight about why I'm actually not gloomy about the state of the country. I'm going to talk about a lot about our problems, and I talk until I can think of something cheerful to say, and then I'll sit down. When my friend William Buckley ran for mayor of New York in 1965, he was asked at his first press conference, "Mr. Buckley, what's the first thing you'll do if you're elected?" He said, "I will demand a recount." I think a lot of people feel that way. I want to draw you a kind of picture of the many forces impinging on our government. I feel a little bit like the teacher who asked her classroom full of 8-year-olds to draw a picture of whatever they wanted. And as they drew, she circulated among their desks, and she got to the desk of little Sally and said, "Sally, what are you drawing a picture of?" And Sally said, "I am drawing a picture of God." Teacher said, "Sally, no one knows what God looks like." Sally said, "They will in a minute." Let me give you a few data points about our standing. Thanks. I'll read from this later. A character in Hemingway's novel, The Sun Also Rises, is asked, "How did you go bankrupt?" He said, "I went bankrupt 2 ways, gradually and then suddenly." We're approaching the sudden stage, and I'll tell you why in a minute. In 1916, on the eve of the First World War, when federal spending exploded, the richest man in America, John D. Rockefeller, could have written a personal check for his net worth and retired our national debt. Today, the richest man in America, Bill Gates, could write a check for his entire personal net worth and not pay 2 months' interest on the national debt. What we are up against, I'm afraid, is that, first of all, the political class has a permanent incentive to run deficits, to give people $1 worth of government goods and services, and to charge them only 60 cents for it. This is decadent democracy, ladies and gentlemen. We used to borrow money for the future. We borrowed money to fight wars, to preserve freedom, to build roads, highways, dams, bridges, airports for the future. Now we're borrowing from the future, from the unborn, unconsenting generation that will inherit our debts in order to finance the current consumption of government goods and services. This is a kind of decadence, and we are overconfident that we can continue doing it. We're saying, well, so far so good, so far so good. It reminds me, as everything does, of a baseball story, if you'll forgive me. 1951, Warren Spahn, on the way to becoming the winningest left-handed pitcher in the history of baseball, was pitching for the then Boston Braves against the then New York Giants in the then Polo Grounds. And the Giants sent up to the plate a rookie, a kid who was 0 for 12. It was clear the kid would never hit big league pitching. It was a kid named Willie Mays. Spahn stood out on the mound 60 feet 6 inches from home plate, fired the ball. Mays crushed it. First hit, first home run. After the game, the sports writers went up to Spahn in the clubhouse and said, "Spahny, what happened?" He said, "Gentlemen, for the first 60 feet, that was a hell of a pitch." Not good enough in baseball, not good enough in governance. Let me tell you what the problem of the entitlement welfare state that we have is. The welfare state that we have today exists to transfer wealth from the working young and middle-aged to the retired elderly. Every day, beginning on the 1st of January 2008, when the first of 77 million baby boomers began to turn 62 and become eligible for Social Security, every day, from now until 2030, 10,000 baby boomers become eligible every day for Social Security and Medicare. Demography is destiny for a welfare state. The welfare state serves the elderly. The problem is that the welfare state we have today, that we really began to build in 1935 with enactment of the Social Security system, the welfare state exists to subsidize two things that did not exist in 1935. One is protracted retirement, and the other is competent medicine. Let me take retirement and Social Security first, because that's a simple and small problem. We have to go back and learn the lesson of Ida Mae Fuller of Ludlow, Vermont. Ida Mae in 1940 became the first American to receive a regular monthly Social Security check. She'd worked just long enough to be vested in the system, having paid the grand total of $22 in Social Security taxes. Then, in an act of very reckless citizenship, she turned on the country and lived to be 100, collecting in the process $24,000 in benefits. It didn't matter. At that time, there were 42 workers for every retiree. Today, there are 3 workers for every retiree. By the time the baby boomers have all retired, there'll be 2 workers for every retiree. Remember, by the time they retire in 2030, the average age of the American population coast to coast will be higher than it is today in the state of Florida, which is justly known as God's antechamber. The Census Bureau doesn't just keep track of the elderly, it keeps track of a cohort it calls the very old. Those are Americans 85 years old or older. In percentage terms, that is the fastest growing age cohort in the country. That matters because the average health care costs for an 85-year-old are 5 times higher than the cost for a 55-year-old. I'm not against the elderly. I am elderly. And I can prove it. I'm 73 years old, and when I turned 65, the government sent me this very, very attractive Medicare card. I showed it to my doctor. He said, "That's wonderful, George. Now we'll send your bills to your children," which is how the welfare state works. The problem is, now, solving Social Security is a simple problem. The real problem is the average length of retirement in the 20th century expanded from 2 years until 20 years. In 1935, retirement was a luxury of a tiny portion of the American people. It was never designed for this world. It's easy to fix, my goodness. Raise the retirement age faster than we're doing in imperceptible increments to 67. If in 1935 Congress had indexed the retirement age to life expectancy, the retirement age in America today would be 74. We'd have no Social Security crisis. The real problem is medicine. Medicine is swallowing the budget. We have attached, as a matter of entitlement, the most rapidly growing portion of the population, the elderly, to our most dynamic science, medicine. Longevity is a wonderful thing. But competent medicine is a new phenomenon. In 1924, Calvin Coolidge, whose picture Ronald Reagan hung prominently in the cabinet room, Calvin Coolidge, his son, Calvin Jr., played tennis without socks on the White House tennis court. He got a blister, it got infected, and he died an agonizing death. Coolidge had access to the best medicine in the country. Medicine was not very competent until about the time I was born in 1941 in Champaign, Illinois. University town, very good hospitals. But I'm sure, because it was true of almost all hospitals back then, the principal expense of the hospital I was born in was clean linen. This was before MRIs and CAT scans and electron microscopes and laser surgery and all the rest of the pain-relieving, life-extending, diagnostic, therapeutic, pharmacological marvels that we're delighted to have and reluctant to pay for. When Jack Kennedy was president, we were spending 6% of GDP on healthcare. Today it's 18%. We have a welfare state that was not designed for this work. I see a show of hands. How many of you drive a 1935 car? Okay, how many of you use a 1935 cell phone? Personal computer? Ask the same questions about 1965. In 1965, we enact Medicare. At least half the medical treatments now in use did not exist in 1965 when Medicare was passed. You know how many coronary bypass operations Medicare paid for in 1965? 0. The same number of artificial hips and knees. This year, Medicare will pay for 700,000 artificial hips and knees. 1 in 6 artificial hips will be given to an American over 85 years old. As I say, longevity is a wonderful thing, but it is very expensive. So we have to find ways to reform the entitlement state. To give people, frankly, more skin in the game. I can give you all the big numbers, the billions and the millions. The important point is 12 cents. 12 cents is the portion of every healthcare dollar paid for by the person receiving the healthcare. Someone else is paying the other 88 cents. Even before Obamacare was passed, 50 cents of every healthcare dollar in this country was a government dollar. The American people have become increasingly dependent. There is an agenda in Washington to increase the dependency of Americans on government. Everywhere you look, food stamps increase in the last 6 years from 21 million to 51 million people on food stamps. That's more people than live on the west coast of the United States. Energy sector, Keystone Pipeline, permeated with politics. That matters when you think that no less an authority on energy than Nancy Pelosi recently said Americans should use more natural gas rather than fossil fuels. We are not always governed by the brightest Crayolas in the pack. Well, the standard answer that people give is, well, let's just keep raising taxes. The problem is you reach a point of diminishing returns. The progressive agenda is an attempt to change our national character, to destigmatize dependency on government, to make us think that that's perfectly normal. And by changing the social norms to change national character, to make us all permanent wards of the state, thoroughly and forever from cradle to grave. Now, those people who say, well, we'll just raise taxes to pay for all this, don't understand that the private sector, by its vigor, must throw off the revenues to pay the bills, and the more you raise taxes, the more you suffocate the energies of the private sector, causing a death spiral of the welfare state. I have a modest proposal, and that is whenever an American is handed a ballot, it should have stapled to it a graph. The graph would have intersecting lines, the rising line showing more and more Americans dependent on the government, the declining line showing declining participation in the income tax system. Top 1% of American earners pay 39% of the income tax. Top 5% pay 60% of the income tax. Top 10% pay 70% of the income tax. And here's the dynamite. The bottom 50% of American earners pay 3% of the income tax. 60% of America's families either pay no income tax or less than 5% of their income. This is what economists call a situation of moral hazard, a situation in which the incentives are for perverse behavior. A large and growing majority of Americans have no incentive to restrain the growth of a government they're not paying for. Now, we're about to learn the truth of what Will Rogers said when he said the difference between death and taxes is that death doesn't get worse every time Congress meets. Lord knows we need tax reform. I do not know why we have a corporate income tax. Corporations don't pay taxes, they collect taxes, passing it on as a cost of doing business. We have the highest corporate tax rate in the world. We're surprised that corporations have $2 trillion worth of earnings overseas because this is the worst country in the world in which to earn a profit. Why, can someone explain to me, why is death a taxable event in this country? 1980, the Philadelphia Phillies won the World Series. And after the last game, all the sports writers went into the clubhouse to talk to the Phillies' madcap relief pitcher, Tug McGraw. They said, Tug, what are you going to do with your World Series earnings? He says, I'm going to spend 80% on wine and women, and I'll probably waste the rest. Well, it makes you think. You work hard in America, you get to be 65, 70, and you make a lot of money, and you say, the hell with it, I'm going to Las Vegas and blow it all on wine and women. Go ahead, it's a free country. Try and give it to your children, the government steps in. What's wrong with this picture? What's wrong is our tax code looks increasingly like codified envy. And envy is, strictly speaking, un-American. We are not traditionally an envious people, we're an aspirational people. That's why we're the only developed nation in the world that has never had a large redistribution of socialist party. Furthermore, envy is not fun, by the way. Do you ever think that envy is the only one of the 7 deadly sins that doesn't give the sinner even momentary pleasure? I'll pause while you go down the list. You know, Mark Twain could be a great scourge of the rich. He gave the name to the Gilded Age. It was the title of one of his unsuccessful novels. But his best friend was a hugely rich, successful executive of Standard Oil, the great Satan of its day. And this journalist once went up to Twain and says, Mr. Twain, don't you believe your friend's wealth is tainted? Mark Twain said, you're damn right, it's doubly tainted. It taint yours and it taint mine. The reason our politics is, the temperature of our politics is high today is that the stakes are high. Stakes are high because we're arguing about fundamentals. We're arguing about how the citizens should be related to the central government. We're talking about the actual competence and proper scope of government. These are essential matters. We are talking about, and the parties are way divided as never before, on where the creative energy of our society is. Is it in the government that must organize our life and make sure we're creative? Or is it in the spontaneous cooperation of individuals in a market society? Ted Kennedy once said, all change in America begins at the ballot box. That's a clear statement of the progressive view that politics is central, that we have a government-centered society and life. Joe Biden, the gift who keeps on giving. Didn't you love it in the fall of 2008, Lehman Brothers melts down, we're in financial freefall. Biden says, well, in October 1929, when the stock market crashed, President Roosevelt went on television You cannot make Joe Biden up. I mean, Biden recently said every important idea of the last 2 centuries has depended on government vision and incentive. I think this government-centered view of the world is refuted by every page of American history. In the 1790s, a young Yale graduate went south to Georgia to be a tutor on a plantation, and he got tired of listening to the planters sit around the kitchen table complaining about how to separate cotton seeds from cotton fibers, so this young man named Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. Made the plantation system profitable, led to the spread of slavery, brought on the Civil War in the modern world, which is rather a lot of change, and it didn't begin at the ballot box. It began in the spark of genius in one entrepreneurial mind. In the 1830s in central Illinois, where men are men and I am from, in the town of Grand Detour, Illinois, which I just looked up and is 5.6 miles from Dixon, Illinois, where Ronald Reagan spent his formative years. In Grand Detour, Illinois, a young blacksmith got interested in inventing a self-scouring steel plow that could turn the heavy black topsoil of the Midwest. He did, and his name's on big green machines all over the world. His name is John Deere. Didn't begin at the ballot box. When Alexander Graham Bell's voice came down that wire and said, "Watson, come here, I want you." When Ray Kroc drove into the McDonald's Brothers restaurant in San Bernardino, California, and got an idea that became not just a great corporation, but a whole industry, didn't begin at the ballot box. This is the question we're talking about. Where's the creative energy? What should government do to tell us how to think and act and price things? I want you to understand what happens when this goes wrong, when government gets that answer wrong. I want you to come back with me to a crime scene. The crime occurred at 138 Griffith Street in Jersey City, New Jersey in April 1934. The second year had just begun of the New Deal. I recently visited this neighborhood just to see the crime scene. Today, as then, it's a neighborhood of immigrants. Today, they're from mostly Latin America and Asia. Then they were mostly from Eastern Europe. 138 Griffith Street today is a barber shop. Then it was a man's tailoring and pressing shop owned by Joseph Magid, a 49-year-old immigrant from Poland, father of 2 daughters. The crime he committed was he put in his shop window a sign that said he would press a man's suit for 35 cents. Now, you may well wonder, how did that become a crime in the land of the free and the home of the brave? I'll tell you. The New Deal had a theory. Their first theory was that they were terribly smart and they knew everything. They had a brains trust, if they did say so themselves, and they did so obnoxiously and incessantly. Their theory was that when you have a depression, prices fall. Therefore, huge non sequitur, therefore, we would have a recovery if we could force prices to rise. Therefore, we must outlaw competition, because competition lowers prices. So the New Deal made price cutting an antisocial and in some ways criminal behavior. So they passed the National Recovery Act to write codes of competition, actually codes of non-competition, to stop people from competing. You may remember from your high school civics textbook, the symbol of the National Recovery Administration was the Blue Eagle. People were encouraged to fly the Blue Eagle flag over their factories or put Blue Eagle posters in their shop windows. Philadelphia Eagles football team was founded at this time and named in honor of the National Recovery Administration, which is why all good Americans hate the Philadelphia Eagles. But the geniuses in Washington had decided that the proper price for pressing a man's suit was 40 cents. Magid was guilty of a nickel economic crime, for which he was fined $100. Doesn't sound like much, but the median family income that year was $1,500, and sentenced to a month in jail for price cutting in America. And it just didn't happen in Jersey, it happened all over the country, prosecutions like this. Well, in Magid's case, the judge thought this was highly amusing and a teachable moment, so he canceled the fine and canceled the sentence and hauled Magid back into court where, and here I'm quoting from the New York Times, the judge gave him a little lecture on the importance of cooperation as opposed to individualism. Well, Magid, duly chastened, left the courtroom, accompanied by the New York Times, went back to his shop in Jersey City and removed from his shop window the offending sign promising to press a suit for 35 cents and put in its place the Blue Eagle. And the next morning, the New York Times said, Magid, if not quite so ruggedly individualistic as formerly, was a free man once more. Well, he was a free man if you define freedom as embracing a government propaganda symbol under the threat of fines and imprisonment. I don't. That happened in this country. because the government thought it knew everything, thought it was wiser than markets at sorting out prices and opportunity and wealth. Now, I know what you're saying. Say, well, we don't do that anymore. We're much smarter than that. This, ladies and gentlemen, is the Senate immigration bill. 1,197 pages. It has to be this long because the senators know everything. Well, smarty pants out there, do you know the proper wage, hourly wage of an immigrant animal sorter in 2016? What, silly you, it's $9.84. It's right here in the Senate bill. That's 20 cents more than the wage, this too is in there, of an immigrant nursery worker. Senators are really impressive, aren't they? They know these things. Did you know that Nevada is a border state? I know, the southern tip of Nevada is 164 miles north of the border, but as Chico Marx said, who are you going to believe, me or your eyes? There's another $20 billion in border security pork in this, and Harry Reid of the great state of Nevada wanted Nevada to be eligible for border pork, so they just declared Nevada's a border state. This unimpressive little thing is the Homestead Act of 1862. By any measure, one of the half dozen most important pieces of legislation ever passed. This 2 pages. To be fair, it's 4 pages on the parchment copy in the National Archives, which means it's 1,193 pages shorter than this. The Homestead Act was actually our first immigration bill. We had no immigration laws back then. We just wanted people to come in, get to work, become Americans, and populate that portion of the country west of the Mississippi that was identified on all our maps as the Great American Desert. No one lived out there. 4 pages. It worked. That's how we used to do things. This is what happens, and Maggid's prosecution, when government loses sight of what makes America special. Loses sight of the spontaneous cooperation of Americans that Alex de Tocqueville marveled at in the Jacksonian America. Loses sight of the fact that freedom requires space to breathe. Loses sight of the fact that we built a government that's hard to move. We did it deliberately. You know, people say, oh, we have this terrible problem of gridlock. Ladies and gentlemen, gridlock is not an American problem. It's an American achievement. When the founders went to Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, they did not go to create an efficient government. The idea would have horrified them. They wanted a safe government. You know why? Because the most important word in the Declaration of Independence is secure. All men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and governments are instituted among men to secure their rights, not give them their rights. The rights pre-exist government. Government exists to secure our pre-existing natural rights, and therefore is inherently limited. To that end, they created a complicated government. 3 branches of government, 2 branches of the legislative branch, veto overrides, judicial review, supermajorities, all kinds of ways of slowing the government down. But I can think of nothing the American people have wanted intensely and protractedly that they didn't get. Now look, Washington, it's not pretty to watch, I understand that. Washington functions the way the old Washington Senators baseball team functioned when the saying was, Washington first in war, first in peace, and last in the American League. They were run back then by a man named Clark Griffith, who said, the fans like home runs, and we have assembled a pitching staff to please our fans. Well, you listen to the talk out of Washington and the complaining and all that, and you get pessimistic. But remember, no one ever got rich betting against the United States. We are not Bangladesh. We are a country that can get better by choosing to get better. You know, Winston Churchill, who loved our country as much as he loved his American mother, said the American people invariably do the right thing after they have exhausted all the alternatives. We're pretty far down the list. You listen to the people complaining and the nastiness in Washington, you probably feel a little bit the way Earl Weaver used to feel. Earl was the Hall of Fame manager of the Baltimore Orioles. He was a short, irascible, Napoleonic little figure. And when he was out of sorts, as he usually was by the third inning, he was the scourge of American League umpires. He'd come barreling out of the dugout, stick his chin into the chest of a much larger umpire, and at the top of his lungs he'd shout, "Are you going to get any better, or is this it?" Things are going to get better. There is an attempt afoot, as I said, to change social norms and change our national character, to end American exceptionalism. De Tocqueville said the American people are exceptional because we were born free. Unlike Europe, we had no feudal past, hence no entrenched aristocracy, hence no established church. We had an exceptional revolution, one that didn't say we're going to give you happiness, it said we're going to set you free to pursue happiness as you define it. We have an exceptional constitution, one that doesn't say what the government must do for us, but what the government may not do to us. And that's what we're arguing about. Is that Constitution still effective, viable? Does it still limit the government, or does it just permit the government to do anything it wants? I think the American people still understand that a benevolent government is not always a benefactor, that capitalism doesn't just make us better off, it makes us better by enforcing thrift, industriousness, deferral of gratification, all the stern virtues of individualism that got poor maggots sent to jail. I think the American people understand that when Jack Kennedy said, "Us not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country," one thing you can do for your country is to reserve a spacious portion of your life for which your country's not responsible. I think they understand certainly what Milton Friedman meant when he said, look, take any three letters from the alphabet, doesn't matter which ones, pick them at random. Put them in any order you want, doesn't matter. You will have an acronym designating a federal agency we can do without. I think they understand what Robert Frost meant when he said, I do not want to live in a homogenized society. I want the cream to rise. And I know they understand what Ronald Reagan meant when he said, I do not want to go back to the past. I want to go back to the past's way of facing the future. That's what's at stake in our argument today. Whether we're going to live in a government-centered society or a market-driven, individualistic, spontaneously cooperative society of free men and women. I want to live in a society where an individual defines excellence on his own terms and tries to become the standard of excellence. Which reminds you, it will not surprise you to know, of a baseball story. True story, greatest baseball story ever told. Rogers Hornsby, greatest right-handed hitter in the history of baseball, is at the plate, and there's a rookie pitcher on the mound who is quite understandably petrified. And the rookie throws 3 pitches, and the umpire says, ball 1, ball 2, ball 3. Rookie shouts in at the umpire, says, umpire, those were strikes. Umpire takes off his mask, looks out at the rookie and says, young man, when you throw a strike, Mr. Hornsby will let you know. Hornsby didn't swing, wasn't a strike. That's, to me, the idea of America. And that is what we can still preserve if we get busy, because we're running out of time. Because as the government grows and this conscious engine of spreading dependency and destigmatizing dependency and making us comfortable as wards of the government is gaining ground. Fortunately, every few years we have things called elections, and we can change the direction of things. But what I've tried to do to you tonight is to give you some sense of the picture, all the forces, demographic and otherwise, that are driving us towards some moments of real decision. Now, I've talked perhaps too long. I apologize for that. You're probably feeling the way Jeff Torborg did when he was managing the White Sox, and he went out one day to take a pitcher, Jimmy Kern, out of the game. Got to the mound, and Kern said, "Skipper, I'm not tired." Torborg said, "Jimmy, we know you're not tired, but our outfielders are." So, on that note, I will subside. I thank you for hearing me out, and I welcome your questions. Thank you very much.
Thank you, George. As George has mentioned, he's happy to take some questions this evening. We got about 15 minutes, and all I ask if you have a question, if you could raise your hand, we'll have someone in the aisle bring you a microphone. Wait till the microphone's in your hand, and we'll go from there. So if we could start right over here to our left.
Good evening. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
I was wondering if you heard Netanyahu's speech today, if you had any thoughts about it.
I did not. I was on a plane coming to the Reagan Library. But I've known Bibi Netanyahu personally for 35 years. His country faces an existential threat. Iran's supreme leader has described Israel as a one-bomb country. Another Iranian leader has said it's good that the Jews are gathered together in a Jewish state because we can get them all at once. That's what he deals with on a daily basis. Now, intelligent, public-spirited men and women of goodwill can differ as to what to do about Iran. But the idea that the head of America's only, not our best ally in the Middle East, our only ally in the Middle East, should be considered a problem because he wants to give a speech explaining the perils his country lives with by day is an embarrassment to our country. Now, I gather in the 67 years since Israel was founded on 1/6 of 1% of the land in that region, it has not known a day of peace. Peace is more than the absence of war. It is amicability and commodious living between them. Not an hour of peace Israel has known since 1948, when the War of Independence was fought, and the War of Independence for Israel hasn't ended. So my view is this country should be glad to have someone of the experience and intelligence of Benjamin Netanyahu to come and give their point of view. What are we afraid of if we're afraid of speeches? Unbelievable.
Thank you for coming. I know that you discussed a little bit about the need for potential tax reform, and I didn't know if you had any further comments on the need for educational reform here in America.
Oh, yeah. 1983, Ronald Reagan convened a conference called A Nation at Risk, produced a report that contained a very memorable line. It said, "If a foreign power tried to impose upon us the educational mediocrity we've imposed upon ourselves, we'd consider it an act of war." Well, nothing improved, so in 1994, Bill Clinton and Congress gave an edict to the future. Congress passed Goals 2000. They said by the year 2000, we would have 90% graduation rate from high school. It's still about 78. And we would be #1 in the world in math and science. We're not. So in 2001, we gave another edict to the future. We passed No Child Left Behind. It said that by 2014, for those of you keeping score, that's last year, By 2014, there would be 100% proficient. 100%, we don't mess around in Washington. 100% proficiency in reading and math. The scary thing is we almost got there because we gave a financial incentive to every state to dumb down its standards of proficiency. Now, we can keep doing this. We can keep throwing money at schools. We did this for years. After the Second World War, when the baby boom generation began going through the public schools like a pig through a python, everyone agreed that the best predictor of the school's performance is the amount of money you spend on it. Increased financial inputs, cognitive outputs will increase. So we did under both parties. Class sizes got smaller, schools were built, teachers' salaries went up. Everything improved except test scores. So we had the biggest social science survey in American history. It was conducted in the 1960s to find out what was going on. Produced the Coleman Report. You know what the Coleman Report said? It's all families. 90% of the differences in schools' performance can be explained not by the money you spend on it, by variables such as the quantity and quality of reading matter in the home, the amount of homework done in the home, the amount of television watched in the home. But most of all, don't tell me the pupil-teacher ratio, tell me the pupil-parent ratio. Today, with family disintegration galloping, this month, right now, is the 50th anniversary of the Moynihan Report. 1965, Pat Moynihan, then a 38-year-old social scientist in the Labor Department, published a report called The Negro Family, the Case for National Action. He said there is a crisis because 23.7% of African American children are born out of wedlock. Today it's 72%. It's 40% for all American first births of all races and ethnicities. Today, ladies and gentlemen, now you think about this, a majority of mothers under 30 are not living with the fathers of their children. A majority. Now, we know what that means. It means a constantly renewed cohort of adolescent males raised without fathers. We know what that means. Unruly neighborhoods and schools where disciplining crowds out teaching. As Pat Moynihan said, from the wild Irish slums of the East Coast in the 19th century to the barrios of Los Angeles, the lesson of history is unambiguous. When you have a large cohort of unparented adolescent males, you have chaos. There are limits to what schools can do to do the work of families. Families can't teach algebra, but families can teach the normal civilizing process of getting along in life. A teacher in Chicago says she regularly gets 7-year-olds coming to school who don't know numbers, shapes, or colors. No one, while making dinner, ever said 10 green round peas. The biggest problem America faces is family disintegration. I don't care what anyone, because the question was about schools. Let me just say, look, what we have to do is get the federal government out of the business of trying to make the schools as wonderful as Amtrak and the post office. Turn this all back to the states. Get rid of anything remotely like Common Core. Promote school choice so that you have a market and competition and things will get better.
Right over here.
What's practically the solution? So long as government promises enough people something, they'll be elected. So what is necessary? Is that a change in the people themselves before you can change the government?
Well, that's right. You have to change some minds. We have to persuade. Our government rests on public opinion, and public opinion is shiftable sand. Therefore, we have to go to the people and say, First of all, Margaret Thatcher was right. She said about a welfare state. She said, sooner or later, you run out of other people's money. And yet they come for your money. We have to convince people, and it shouldn't be that hard, that we are now so suffocated economic growth that we are pleased. The president says, wonderful. We had a quarter's growth of 5%. One growth, my God. Ronald Reagan, in the recovery from the '82 recession, Ronald Reagan's administration produced 5 quarters of 7% growth, 4 years of 5% growth. We're being asked to settle for a new normal, a sluggish, Japan-like, stagnant economy forever as the price of having a government of this weight. We can't settle for that. We can't dare settle for that because the welfare state will collapse.
How do we change the basic nature then of this country?
Well,
the willingness to accept that type of government.
The changes that have to be, we have made to ourselves promises we cannot afford to keep through the welfare state. But if we modify those a little bit, the savings are trillions. Paul Ryan has shown us how to do this. I strongly, tomorrow, the Supreme Court is going to hear arguments in a case that could be the end of the Affordable Care Act, of Obamacare. And when that happens, the Republicans, I think, will have ready an alternative. And this is going to be one of the big climb downs. You know, we've had successes before. The greatest legislative success of the 1990s was the Welfare Reform Act that Bill Clinton vetoed twice before he was compelled to sign it. And you know what happened? Aid to families with dependent children, a portion of the sacrosanct Social Security Act, was repealed. We repealed an entitlement. It was a lifetime entitlement. We said now there's a 5-year limit, and to be eligible, you have to go into job training and seek work. What happened was, everyone said, oh, the world's going to end. What happened was 60% decline in welfare caseload in the country. So there is precedent for beginning to dismantle parts of the welfare state. Let's just make some more precedents.
Over here.
On a different note, Ernie Banks passed away a few weeks ago. Would you please share your favorite memory of Chicago's most beloved baseball player?
Yeah, I mean, Ernie actually has, this is the saddest story of all. Ernie has one record. He holds the major league record for the most games played without ever playing in the postseason. That's what you get for being with the Cubs. What made Ernie so wonderful was he was the only conceivable reason to go to Wrigley Field, that and the old-style lager beer, and that was it. Ernie was, of course, indomitably cheerful. Roses are red, violets are blue, it's a beautiful day, let's play too. That was Ernie Banks. There was no one batting behind him. There's no reason in the world why anyone should throw him a strike. And still he hit 512 home runs. You know, you go to Wrigley Field, you can buy a T-shirt that says, any team can have a bad century. But Ernie was such an optimist. If he were here tonight, he'd say the Cubs are now they last won the World Series, as you may know, in 1908, which was before Ronald Reagan was born. But that means Ernie would say we're in the 107th year of our rebuilding effort.
I think we have a question right over here. Right here.
We were all raised in San Bernardino, so we appreciate the Ray Kroc reference. We also feel that if you don't pass that, how the hell do we know what's in it?
Exactly.
And once and for all, can you tell us, did Babe Ruth really call a shot?
There's a marvelous book on sale in your bookstore upstairs by me called A Nice Little Place on the North Side. And it goes into some length and I think pretty clearly demonstrates that Ruth did no such thing. Ruth never claimed to have done it. He was always coy about that. I'll tell you what happened. The Cubs had a shortstop named Billy Georges. Billy Georges had a girlfriend. The girlfriend had a gun. And Billy Georges decided to end it, and the girlfriend decided to end Billy Georges. So she went to his hotel room, shot him. Didn't kill him, but he couldn't play shortstop for a while. So the Cubs went out and got a shortstop from out here in the Pacific Coast League who had been a teammate of Babe Ruth's. They'd actually fought in the clubhouse. They hated each other. But because he came to the Cubs in August, the Cubs, when they got to the World Series, did not vote him a full share. And the Yankees thought that was pretty cheap behavior, which it was. And therefore, the Yankees and the Cubs were yelling at each other and being mean to each other and being rude. And it was in the midst of all of this that Babe Ruth supposedly pointed at the bleachers and hit the next ball there. Didn't happen. But as you'll see, what did happen, and Cub fans are justifiably proud, the Chicago Cubs won the Cold War. Not enough people appreciate this. They won the Cold War because Bill Wrigley, who owned the Cubs, bought Catalina Island. And then he brought the Cubs out to do the spring training in Catalina Island. And in the 1930s, a Des Moines radio broadcaster named Dutch Reagan asked his Des Moines radio station if they would send him to California to cover the Cubs on Catalina Island, which they did. And while he was out here, he decided, what the heck, I'll get a screen test. He went into pictures, became governor, became president, and ended the Cold War. So the Cubs won the Cold War. Very simple.
I'd love to say on that note, but we actually have time for one last question. I think we have one right over here.
I'll stick with the Cubs real quick. Fellow Illinoisan, I was so excited in 2003, and I'm just wondering your opinion whether Moises Alou actually had a chance to catch that foul ball.
Probably not, because I was at that game, and I was sitting with Andy MacPhail, who was the president of the Cubs, and Andy looked at the replay on the monitor in front of him and said, good call. What he meant was the umpires were right to say that Steve Bartman, when he did this, that Bartman did not reach onto the field of play. If he had, it would have been fan interference. The umpire didn't call that because he didn't reach onto the field of play, which meant that Alou would have had to gone into the stands to get it. And Cub fans, unlike fans of 29 other teams, are not smart enough to get out of the way. And besides, it's a high wall out there. Alou, if Alou had not gone like that and had a kind of mini tantrum, and Alou to this day says he's very sorry he did, Bartman would not be in the witness protection program today. The answer is no. I don't think he could have caught it.
Okay. With that, if you all would please join me in giving a round of applause for the field. Thank you.